So what I was planning to do with this episode is I'm going to introduce Coop here, but we were going to talk about the carnivore diet, the pros and cons of using that diet, and also introducing carbohydrates into carnivore style diet. And Coop's been working with a lot of my clients over the years. He's helped me a lot, and he also has a book that he's put out. I've read it. It's pretty interesting. It's to the point, and it's got a lot of his concepts in here that we're going to talk about. So I'm going to let Coop talk a little bit about his background, and then we're just going to go through it.
Sounds good, man. Thanks for having me on, especially after all these years of knowing each other. I feel like we're overdue for a chat.
For sure.
Yeah, so my name is Matt Cooper. Most people probably know me as Coop or Coach Coop, as all my athletes call me. I am a strength and conditioning coach and a nutrition consultant. I work with everybody from pro athletes all the way sometimes to people with conditions. Mostly, I work with athletes. In addition to that, I'm also a researcher and an author in the health and performance space too. And as Zach just spoke to, I have a number of kind of single subject ebooks that are either out or coming out that kind of speak to a certain topic. I may decide to combine them into one thing later on, but I essentially bridge the gap from kind of that integrative health meets human performance, strength and conditioning, and yeah, I think that's about it.
So as far as the carnivore, and I've read it, your book, and I love the carnivore. I've been doing it for the last year. And when I switched over to really eating high fatty meats, but I never stopped doing my carbs because that was one thing you always told me. And so I just kept my carbs around 50 to 100 grams. If I'm training really hard, I'll go up to 100 grams. But I found that just adding that high fatty meat in with a low carb, your vitamins, your minerals, you just get in check. And, I can't believe how much at my age now, I'm almost 44. My birthday's in a couple of days here. And, my strength levels feel like when I was, in my mid 30s. So, there's no doubt that there are some benefits, but there's a lot of talks out there right now about, electrolyte deficiencies and long term how your testosterone can go down. So why don't you just talk through some of these points? First, let's just talk about the positives, and then we can talk more about in depth about some of the negatives that you see.
Yeah, absolutely. And if people want kind of like a written out version of this, as you put it, I have a fairly like to the point um, ebook on carnivore and why it seems to work well for some people, like why we see some people reporting better cognition and mental acuity, better focus, diminished gut issues, and just kind of improving body composition. Why those things happen and why we can do that maybe without carnivore, like what's going on under the hood that we can maybe deduce and say, all right, we can learn this from carnivore. This is good. This is an improvement on what we were doing. But it doesn't necessarily have to be this extreme, right? So just want to put that out there. I think the benefits of carnivore, first of all, I think that it's an improvement over what most people are doing already, but I don't think it's the only eating meat part that's really doing it, right? People have to remember when people switch to a diet, whether it's carnivore or anything else, keto, even the other side of the spectrum, sometimes for plant-based people, it's like they tend to cut out hundreds of processing ingredients when they go to carnivore, and they're probably eating a better benefit, or excuse me, a more beneficial level of protein and increasing their protein, which we know your average person probably doesn't get enough of. They're probably also, in addition to eliminating all those inflammatory processing ingredients and things like seed oils and maybe excess like wheat and gluten, those are a lot of different levers going on under the hood that I could have pulled without only eating meat. But people have this kind of black and white read on it where they're like, all right, well, it must have
It
been
must be
all
the
this other
meat.
stuff I'm eating. But when you kind of glance backward a little bit and take a 30,000 foot view, you could say, all right, well, maybe just a lot of the vegetables that I was eating were inflammatory or have anti-nutrients in there that are causing bloating. Maybe some of the carb sources that I was eating were the problem. Maybe it wasn't just carbs in general. Maybe it was, and my ratio of macronutrients, maybe it was the source more than anything, right? I also find that when people tend to change diets, they tend to eat maybe a little bit more ideal ratio of a caloric intake too, right? So I think that you're seeing a lot of improvements from what people were doing before, but it doesn't mean that carnivore is the end all be all. It just might be a stepping stone for them, and then ideally they get a little bit they can be a little bit less.
More flexible with their diet.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Less. I call a carnivore a sledgehammer diet because it's like you're making this big, fat, sweeping change, cutting out this one nutrient, meat in some cases, plants in some cases, carbs for some people, and then they attribute all the benefits to that one thing instead of saying, "Oh, okay, maybe there are some things that were going on under the hood that I could accomplish without being on such an extreme restrictive diet." But tying it back to your first question, what you tend to see with people is more focus, better body composition, some nutrient reloading that just kind of makes them feel, good and more energetic in general. And then you tend to see people start to rehabilitate themselves from gut injury, just the same way that someone might rehabilitate from like a calf strain or something like that.
Now,
That being said,
what I thought was interesting, I just recently had a client. I just wanted to hear your opinion. Again, I'm not someone I give pointers, but I'm not a nutritionist by any means. That's why I'm bringing you in. But the girl, if she ate meat, then she'd have all these problems with her stomach. So she switched to just plants and vegetables and things like that. And before that, obviously, she was she comes from a Mexican background, so she was living in Mexico City. You got the beans, you have the rice, and you have the meat. So if she went to maybe a straight carnivore diet and eliminated all processed foods, then maybe it would have been the same results. But it's interesting to hear her, like, if I ate protein, like, my stomach couldn't handle the digestion. So that's what I thought was interesting.
for sure, yeah. I mean, it could also be like what oil was the food prepared in? Um, does she have some sort of like gut bile issue where she might not have the ability to absorb meat as well? She went away from it. Was she eating certain kinds of meat that maybe like had some weird processing ingredients, as you put it? Was it prepared with things that were maybe inflammatory? So um, I posted about
But
this
do you think
before.
that you can take the reverse extreme and go more to plants
Oh
if you
yeah,
have to initially in order to clear your gut, and then introduce meat back in? Do you think that those are interchangeable, and it's more about the processed food and more about the person to person?
that's a good question. I don't think it's ever a good idea to cut out meat. I do think some people might start with like, or should I say, animal products. I think some people might have to buy us more eggs and maybe more like bone broth and gelatin type protein sources in the beginning. But
Well,
yeah,
that's
there.
kind of and that's kind of what she did. So yeah, she didn't cut protein out completely, but she was definitely like, she lowered her intake and she was focused more on the other things. So yeah.
Yeah, I'd have to, maybe have more context. But for people like us in the athlete community, even obviously some bodybuilders, a lot of us have tend to, done the chicken and brown rice or chicken and broccoli diet at one point and really overconsume protein. And so that, yeah, there for sure was a point in my life, at least in some of my athlete clients' life, where we had amino acid overabundances in some cases and deficiencies in another, like an excess of things like tryptophan and methionine. And so when and usually that can result in some like sulfur blockades in the body too. And so people in that context tend to experience a ton of fatigue, maybe like hair loss issues, stuff like that. And so when they lower protein, they tend to feel a lot better. But I would say your average everyday person probably needs to do the opposite of
Right.
increase
That's what I
protein.
was thinking with her. And so I was telling her, I was like, look, I was like, now that your gut's healthy, you're training, like, you're gonna have to eat a certain amount of protein. So I just told her, like,
Yeah.
let's just take it easy. Why don't you start with, you're doing 60 grams a day, why don't you go to 80 and just go slow, and just get your confidence back, and then you can always, ramp it up to 125 grams, if she weighs like, I think, 130 or 140. I mean, at some point, maybe if she's training hard enough, she's going to want to be able to up the protein up to that level.
Yeah, I think she'll have to go at least to 100, 100 grams probably for
Right.
most people is good. And that can include things like collagen and gelatin too. So it's really not that hard to hit.
And what's your opinion on, like, protein powders? Like, are you really able, if you got 20 grams, I know this is a big topic, 20 grams in your collagen protein, and then you eat a piece of chicken that has 5 ounces, say 30 grams of protein. Are you going to absorb maybe 10 grams of that 20, and 15 grams of the of the chicken, or is it more like you're only going to absorb 5 grams and the chicken's more beneficial because you're gonna absorb it easier? I mean, you're going to absorb more of the protein.
Basically asking if like whole food protein's more bioavailable than shake based. Yeah, so for sure. I mean, most whey proteins are probably going to be like indigestible proteins. I've seen like inconsistent bioavailability ability with those things. Right? It's like I'm not convinced that people absorb all of them. I think there's a lot of waste products, like potentially a lot of like waste products and fillers that can
Right.
may or may not get stored in the body, but I can't imagine are good for your digestive tract. So I think that collagen and gelatin protein powders can be great. And that's kind of more like a superfood because really all it is, it's not that processed. It's just ground up connective tissues of animals, right? Um, it's not like it has to go through a ton of weird quote unquote processing like some of the ways do. That being said, I do think similar to dairy, I think that there are some ways out there that are a higher quality, probably ones that are a little bit closer to the innate form of milk. I know some people do good with colostrum protein, for example. Anyways, those ones are probably going to be the ones that are better absorbed, and you're going to get a higher amount uh, bioavailability there. Ideally, I don't really think people should be using shakes outside of the collagen and gelatin, though.
And
I try to get
I
more
tell
whole food.
people, I say, look, if you want to do one shake a day and get like 20 grams out of that, I'm okay with it. But try to get the rest from, meat sources. And how do you feel about that?
I think for student athletes, they probably have a little bit more of a more gut durability, so they can probably tolerate the level of maybe like the benefit to potential gut cost ratio of protein powders. Like I said, I think it's all in the quality of the whey protein more than anything. I would say, yeah, try to get a shake in, but maybe make it collagen or gelatin instead of whey, and get everything else from whole food,
Right.
meat, eggs, good dairy, stuff like that.
Now, one of the things that the carnivores talk about, and this is something that I've been kind of running around in my head is, and again, I'm more of a carnivore based style, I would say at this point in my life, but and it's helped me. But as far as what was I going to say? I'm losing my train of thought. Oh, the protein in. So what their main thing is, they say, okay, if you want to keep your electrolytes, you don't want to have to take a ton of sodium, or you want to keep your sodium, keep you from urinating it out. Then the key is going to be is to eat a high amount of protein, at least twice per day at your main meals, so that you spike your insulin and then you can retain that. And what's kind of like your view on that? And that's how they say, okay, that's your way of spiking. And then you're able then to retain, and you don't have to use then the carbohydrates in order to retain your electrolytes and salts.
So you got it. You're saying some people are saying that a higher protein diet will help them retain more electrolytes, or high
Right,
protein in
because you're
combination
spiking
with salts and
you're
electrolytes.
spiking, basically you're spiking your insulin when you eat enough protein at a meal, and therefore now you're more in an anabolic state where you're more in a storing state, so that you're going to hold more on to your electrolytes. That's basically what they're scientific, because they say this is science, this is true, and this is all you need to do. You don't need to eat carbohydrates. You just have to eat enough meat at each meal, and then you'll be more in an anabolic state instead of a catabolic state.
Got it. Okay. So yeah, just a couple things to unpack there. I would say that yeah, in general, the less carbs you're going to eat, probably the better idea it is to go higher in protein. I don't think that's necessarily. I don't think that's necessarily ideal. But at the same time, I do think that there are a lot of people in kind of that ancestral health and who flirt with carnivore and keto community, like Dr. Sean Baker or Rob Wolf, the research biochemist. Both those guys who I respect a ton, even if I don't eat necessarily the same as them.
Right.
They'll even talk about how a lot of times why people feel not great on carnivore and keto is because they have an insufficiency of electrolytes. So you have to remember the hydrate and carbohydrate is literal. There's water and
Right.
hydration
That's how you retain your
components in the carbs
glucose.
that we eat.
Right.
1,000%, right? And orange juice, for example, like milk, things like that, have electrolytes and minerals in them. So I think that because if you're going to be going lower carbs, or low relative to what you should be doing as an athlete, even in that strike zone, you're probably, if anything, going to be at a more of a premium for electrolytes. I do think there, like to your
Right.
point, there is a
Right.
protective potential of higher protein in the face of lower carbs, kind of like preserving mass. But over a longer period of time, and we talked about this in the car too, on the phone in the car too, was it's kind of like the gluconeogenesis thing to me kind of suggests the opposite, right? A lot of people in the keto community, whether you're for or against it, they all agree that it's the backup system. If I don't have carbs, my primary energy source, I resort to breaking myself down, fat, hopefully, in order to use that for fuel, right? That's sort of the thesis of it. And they said, well, that's how our ancestors lived. So my thing with that is that actually, like what I take from that is not that that's the ideal system. It's actually that, well, if our
Survival.
body wants glucose so bad it's willing to cannibalize itself, it's probably pretty important to include that still, right? Especially as an athlete, you and I have maybe have a little bit lower activity than your average athletes who may not need as much carbs, but I still think your average everyday person is going to need more carbs than carnivore would suggest, and your average athlete's going to need a lot more carbs.
No, it's a great answer. I mean, that's what I'm thinking. When even if I eat a high volume of protein and fat or high fatty meats, like literally, like if I train pretty hard that day with the weights and I eat at like 11, and say I trained at like 8, like literally like 2 hours later, like I'm starving. But if I have carbohydrates, just a little bit right after that, I can see myself sustaining for a longer period of time of energy levels, which tells me like, and this is me, obviously case by case, but I think if you're dealing with an athlete, there has to be an introduction of some point with glucose on a certain level. And I think what's interesting what you're telling me is that, certain training days, if the demands are high and you're weight training, you're doing like a Marv Marinovich style, you're going in, you're hitting your weights or, his fan resistance machines. Then you're doing plyos and jumps. And then later on that day, you're going and you're doing your running, your 150s or your short sprints. I mean, you're telling me on that day that you're just going to consume meat and fat and that you're going to be okay. I don't see it possible in that setting. I don't see that that you're going to feel absolutely healthy when you're ingesting that much protein and fat, when all you need to do is just and to keep your electrolytes in. So, that's kind of where I'm at. I don't know your thoughts on that when you have that much high intensity.
Yeah, totally. And I break down in the article what you're missing when you're doing carnivore from carbs and how that's not just glucose, it's also things like insufficient CO2, insufficient fructose, things like that, and maybe minerals and certain nutrients and what that means under the hood. But in a simple context, yeah, I mean, your fast twitch muscle fibers are best fed with carbohydrates based on what we know. I know the science here, is people like Dr. Andy Galpin are always pointing out, is still kind of being fleshed out. But based on what we know, our type 2B muscle fibers, the ultra hairline trigger fast twitch ones, they're only fed with carbs. And then the intermediate ones can be fed with both carbs and fat. I actually think that morphologically speaking, the more you're going to feed it fat and not carbs, it's going to shift towards a slower innervation potential or a slower twitch muscle fiber. I think the more you're feeding it carbohydrates, the more it's going to be able to be on that kind of like your physiology is more robust on like a hairline trigger. And we could also, I know we talked about this in the car and you wanted to touch on it earlier, but I could also talk about the hormonal potential or the hormonal consequences of carnivore and what hormonally you're missing out on if you're doing carnivore.
No, I think
If you want.
I'd love to. We touch on all this. Um, why don't we talk about one thing is fructose, and then we can move into uh, the hormones and the T3 and the T4 and that kind of thing. So as far as fructose goes, I know we were just talking about carbohydrates and athletes, and what I know everyone's like fructose. You don't know, no fruit. It's got fructose, but to me, what makes the most sense about it is it doesn't spike your insulin per se. So you could have a bunch of protein, high fatty proteins, then you eat the fructose. It's gonna basically replace your liver glycogen, from what I understand, and it's not going to have as much effect on your insulin. Now, if you're drinking soda all day long, that's another thing. But I think for athletes, those types of carbohydrates seem like they're ideal, and it also keeps your blood sugar levels at a lower rate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's the other thing too. When you're talking about liver, right? Your liver is not just this kind of like, diabetes or blood sugar regulating thing. That's really kind of the only lip service it tends to get in these discussions. But it actually is to me, you're going to find that it's actually like problems with the liver downstream. Speaking of hormones, are going to affect problems with the thyroid too, right? So when you have problems with the thyroid, you're also going to you're just going to see more hormonal complications with regards to energy, with regards to being able to perform at a high clip, being able to have a robust immune system, being able to just like feel good mood wise day in and day out, right? So all that just to say things like glucose, fructose, things like that, like they're not actually, there's a lot of research showing they actually don't cause fatty liver and things like that. It's actually like higher fat diets, at least ones that are predisposed to having more polyunsaturated or PUFA fatty acids in this day and age, a lot of times coming through seed oils, although even healthier polyunsaturated fatty acids like fish oils, potentially, and you know stuff like that, avocado oil could still be potentially problematic too.
And so now, if you're taking, if you're eating fructose, or if you're not getting carbohydrates, let's say you're not getting carbohydrates, is does your hormonal system, can it become compromised long term, in your opinion? And have you seen that with any clients that have been on carnivore diet?
Yeah, absolutely. So in a couple main ways, right? So for one, if your body doesn't have an easily available energy source in the form of carbohydrates, it always has to work to mine for energy. Again, there's no controversy in saying that. Even the people who are pro keto and carnivore that admit that's how it works, right? So
Glyconeogenesis.
yeah, exactly. So if you always have to mine for energy to work and get that energy, it's not immediately available. Your body tends to bias more stress hormone production, or it runs on stress hormones. And that's actually the carnivore high or the keto high that a lot of people have. And like, I feel great. And it's like the stress hormone release and the stress hormone response can make someone artificially feel better, at least for a period of time. Without really realizing that that's maybe not an ideal response, right? It's kind of a state of like hyper arousal that they mistake for more focus, and that tends to degrade over time, and people feel worse and worse. But that being said, you tend to upregulate things like glucagon, a stress hormone, cortisol, things like that, and you're overtaxing your adrenal, in your adrenergic systems, those adrenaline and stress hormones, right? Collectively, the other thing that happens too is that if your thyroid isn't, it also is kind of like a sledgehammer to your thyroid in terms of how it basically manipulates T3 and T4 hormones. But the other thing too, you got to remember is that if this diet, which is known even by people in the space to degrade thyroid a bit, that means it's going to have it's going to be problematic for converting your cholesterol and saturated fats and things that are precursors to our systemic anti-stress steroid hormones, pregnenolone, testosterone, things like that. It's going to your thyroid converts those types of fats and cholesterols into, or cholesterol sources into those productive hormones. So a lot of times it's like you're having a diet rich in these things, but you're not necessarily utilizing it. And that actually brings us to the next big thing, which is cholesterol. So what it tends to mean is if you have a high cholesterol concentration, usually it's a canary in the coal mine for a thyroid deficiency, because the thyroid is what converts that and mobilizes it into these productive hormones. At the same time, it could, it usually means it's like a canary in the coal mine as an indicator or check engine light for like some sort of systemic stress, right? So although having high cholesterol isn't bad for the reasons that the mainstream necessarily thinks, it's not necessarily like causing heart problems. What it is an indicator of is your thyroid not working well enough to convert good cholesterol sources from your diet, eggs, red meat, things we want to eat, into something like your positive productive stress hormones.
And
And
that's all that, in your opinion, that's from your research, that's all from just completely eliminating carbs and not having that source if you're on a carnivore diet.
yeah, it can also be from things like bad. I mean, any kind of like real stressful input in our modern maladaptive environment is going to, any negative stressor can suppress thyroid production too. You don't necessarily, it's not just coming from no carbohydrates, but yeah, no carbohydrates certainly
It's
isn't
gonna,
going to, right?
no, it makes sense. Now, when you say, just to explain to the audience just a little bit, because some people aren't going to be as caught up on the thyroid. Can you just explain, like, when you don't have, when you're in when you're not burning carbs, you're in a catabolic state, you're using fats, and that's your main fuel source, and you're doing that day in, day out, you're not giving it carbs, then your thyroid then doesn't put out as much for the organs to function as efficiently? Is that what happens? Or
Yeah, it has to do with changing your natural balance of T4, which is the inactive thyroid hormone, to the active one, which is T3. And the other thing too is that, like, so this might have sounded like bro science to us back in the day, but it turns out you do have like a rate of metabolism, or a metabolic speed, and that's really linked in unison, and in some ways the same thing, not exactly, but in some ways the same thing as having a highly functioning thyroid, right? So if your body can't necessarily like get there, what it'll do is it'll adapt to the conditions imposed on it, these stressful conditions, and it'll literally downgrade and slow down your metabolism, so you have a slower metabolism and metabolic rate to adapt to the given conditions, right? And that's what you see with a lot of these people who've gone like low carb over a long period of time, and or had highly stressful conditions over a long period of time, is not only does their whole body tend to work slower metabolically, whether that's thinking and sensory processing or immunological stuff, and we, less immune function, but can also mean like a less robust or less fast operating physiology just makes you slower, right? All the people like that, who tend to train in a maladaptive way, who are endurance athletes, they're they have not enough energy to maintain structure. They tend to look like Yoda, and they tend to be like overly skinny and not as robust and less adaptable to stress overall. And right, part of that is being slower, right? And that's not the only. They're also training to develop more of a slow twitch bias, but also just that whole environmental input. For a lot of these people, the lower carb, the training creates this maladaptive kind of environment, right? So all that just to say, you can kind of recognize a slowed metabolism down in some folks too, right?
so you're saying, like, long term carnivore, some people won't have any issues at all, and some people you may see um some thyroid issues, and you may see, they may not be getting the full benefits. I mean, would you say that carnivores, all of them at some point, should introduce some form of carbohydrates on the daily, or do you think it just person to person?
I think I try not to be overly deterministic or black and white, because I think that there are people who have more robust physiologies. We see that, not even carnivore for a sec. We see that with like athletes like DK Metcalf or Anthony Edwards in the NBA eating BS, and they still can perform at a high clip. So sometimes, athletes' superpower is their ability to overcome bad physiological inputs. I do think you see it catch up with them a lot in later years in age, like, Charles Barkley and stuff like that. A lot of these guys degenerate, lose their hair, that you can kind of, they get less healthy. But I think your average person, yeah, for 99%, if not more, of the people listening to this, you're going to need to add some carbohydrates to that. I do think though that if someone, well, I think that if someone is going to follow a carnivore type diet or a low to moderate carb diet, and if they were choosing to still include things in that diet like sufficient electrolytes, still including like dairy and milk, they were including like raw honey, fruit, which you're even starting to see some of the carnivore people talk about right now with regards to Dr. Ray Peat. Um, if you were going to follow a lower amount of carbs, but we're still like not giving up sugar and some of those things, I think you could actually do okay, all things considered, long term, and you'd find more sustainability and just feeling better in that kind of diet. And I want to be clear, there are days in which I do eat like that. Like if I go a little off the rails, um, over the weekend a little bit and I indulge in more carbs than I would need, then I might, the day after,
Right.
I might just eat kind of more
You're
carnivore-esque.
carnivore.
Yeah, yeah, like a lot lower carbohydrates, maybe not do hardly any that day, or even vegetables, right? So there are times in which I might eat like a carnivore, but that's kind of my main sort of central theme here is I think and then you'll see in the book too, the ebook is carnivore is probably better to follow if you're doing a more hardcore version of it. It's probably better to follow as like a 2 week type, almost like a training block, but for nutritional periodization, a 2 week block, while still making some of these modifications I'm talking about. I do think though that if someone does something like surgery and it's like an athlete rehabbing and they have little to no activity for a while, it could be beneficial to lower carbs compared to what they were having before and sort of take a Ted Naiman protein to energy ethos and bias maybe more protein and a bit less carbohydrates. Still getting plenty, but getting less in that context, right?
Right. So the Ted Naiman is basically you're eating 1 gram per your body weight. So if I weigh 180 pounds, I'm eating 180 grams of protein. Um, and he obviously recommends training as well. I just don't, for me to try to consume that much protein in a day, and he intermittent fast too. And we were talking about this. He'll intermittent fast till, 10, like 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock. And then he shuts his window off at around 8. And he weighs less than me, and he's eating like his body weight. I think it's like 150 grams. I can comfortably get about 130 to 150 grams of protein. And I feel like if I try to cram anything more within that block, then I just don't feel good. My stomach just feels overwhelmed. Now, what I do is if I'm intermittent fasting, and we can talk more about this because I'd like to as well. If I'm intermittent fasting, let's say from 11 to 8 o'clock, that's my one window to eat. But then the next day, if I'm hungry in the morning, I listen to my body. If I train really hard with lifting, jumping, running, I will go and I will have breakfast. I will break my fast and I will have like 3 or 4 meals that day. And I'll probably consume like, 180 grams of protein. But it's kind of like, I kind of like that fasting and then consuming kind of ratio where I'm kind of balancing my body. But I think it's because you and we've been down this path so many times with intermittent fasting, with fasting longer periods of time, with getting our body adjusted to fat oxidation. And therefore, it's much easier for us to listen to the intuition of our body and choose daily. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. Although fasting is going to yield a similar result, like with the mining for energy kind of effect, right? Keto was invented to be a fasting mimicking diet in kids who couldn't follow keto, right? In hospital settings. I do think that for most people, going to be problematic if you fast daily, like a hard dry fast. But I do think that some people can just get away with it and feel all right. And I intermittent fasted for years and I like the schedule of that. I just like, so what I do in the morning is I sort of intentionally break my fast with a small amount of a caloric intake, and then I'm eating a bigger meal at lunch and dinner, right? Athletes I would be having to eat a bit more often than that, but I'm like you, I like that schedule. I just wanted to feel better, so this helps me feel quite a bit better.
So
And
do
I'm
you think
definitely
in my situation, do you think it might be better for me rather than completely fasting every day, is just maybe have 5-10 grams of carbs in the morning? That's maybe
yeah.
when I have the collagen shake. That way, then it's much easier than to get the 150 to 170 grams in that day of
Yeah, it
protein.
depends on the starting point too of someone. Like someone who's maybe less resilient might need more carbohydrates in the morning if they're in a higher stress state. If you're pretty robust, healthy individual overall, I think you can get away with doing like a less carb intake and like stuff in the morning. Like, I don't want to be super prescriptive with any of this stuff because it just can vary so much. But I do think on average, yeah, you want to probably like intentionally break it in the morning in spite of what Dr. Rhonda Patrick says, like things like cellular apoptosis and autophagy. It's not a light switch where you either completely do it or completely don't, right? There's a lot of research showing um, caloric deficit diets, or at least some days that feature caloric deficits, can also induce those same things, right?
For
I think
sure.
that's kind of a myth in that community, is that it's either all or it's nothing, you know?
And
Um,
that's what, when we talked about, you know, how I would do a really high level fasting and, my eyebrow fell out, I'm still growing this back. And I think a lot of that had to do with, not getting enough protein in, and then my thyroid going on overload, like you said, and almost shutting down a little bit. But my testosterone was through the roof. I did a whole nother video on my testosterone being like 1100. And so the question is like, great, I got it up to 1100, but my eyebrow fell out, and I had this, and I didn't have that great of energy. When I started, I don't know what my testosterone is now, but when I started really, okay, you know what, screw the fasting. Like, I'm just going to eat at like 10 or 11. That'll be my first meal. I'm going to get all my calories that I need to in. To me, that's when I started feeling really good. I don't know what my testosterone is. Quite honestly, I don't care, because I see what I'm doing in the weight room now. So that's another question to you, is like, what is is the ultimate to have the highest testosterone, or is that really not that beneficial if you're overloading your system, with the fasting? Because that's what I felt like, the fasting really helped to drive up my testosterone because it was so low.
I think your average person, you're probably going to see the opposite, like we talked about before, because like your thyroid gets degraded, and your ability to convert, cholesterol into testosterone gets impaired, right? And a lot of people think they need TRT and testosterone replacement therapy when they really need is thyroid replacement therapy, and that's not weird like TRT is, where if you raise your levels unnaturally, it might make your estrogen levels raise to match and shut down your own production. Um, Taking thyroid hormone, especially if it's bioidentical, if it, we used to have thyroid in our own meats, so really it's kind of more of a supplement than it is actually a pharmaceutical. And really introducing that helps the whole metabolism in a way that, for a lot of people, especially if you're dosing it right, is not going to have downstream consequences, and a lot of these pro-cancerous pathways that potentially get opened up by doing things like growth hormone or TRT. So I would say, if you're barking up that tree hormonally, you probably need to do certain thyroid labs. If anything, I actually have a potential lab, excuse me, I have a future lab ordering service coming to the website too, where if, your average labs that you get for thyroid and hormones are not, they're kind of don't really show up a lot of these like lower level problems. They kind of only tend to like show
Right.
the
It's like the
signs of
major,
like
like
things you're
my
gonna get.
doctor kept saying, like, oh, your thyroid is good. I mean, all my markers were absolutely perfect. And I kept saying, well, why the hell is my hair falling out? And
Right.
they never have an answer for alopecia. But you got to think, now it's growing back. So you got to think it had it had something to do with, the fasting, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I think, not that I'm saying that, A causes B only, or it's going to happen in everybody's,
Right.
but
I was under a lot of stress too. So I mean, that's all. But at the same time, there's got to be
right.
you're
And
putting a
stress
lot.
is thyroid suppressing as well, But yeah, to your point, I just think that, look, barking up the tree of thyroid hormone before testosterone is ideal. I also, I think if you're 600 or better in testosterone, you're probably all right. I don't necessarily, I think high testosterone is great, but I don't think I would supplement with it exogenously or for TRT, maybe unless I was, had already explored all these other options, healing your gut, making sure you don't have mineral and nutrient imbalances, trying thyroid replacement therapy, stuff like that for a while. And then if I still, you were doing all these things, sleeping better, getting sun, all that stuff, living a better lifestyle, and your testosterone, like, I'd be A, surprised if it wasn't decent or better. And B, maybe then, and I was of age, I would kick the tires on doing something like that. I'm in no way judging people who do that. I just am saying, like, that's sort of the order of operations I would go to. I'd go through A through D before I just jump to UV.
Testosterone.
You know what I mean?